Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Recovery Talk. And this week we are going to talk about all in. So if you've been spending time in online recovery spaces, you may have heard about the term all in, but just let me give some brief background information for those who are unfamiliar with the term. So all in or going all in tends to refer to a specific method of recovery. There is no exact definition of what going all in actually looks like, but in general, it tends to include fully giving into extreme hunger, going completely cold turkey with movement, not weighing yourself, no calorie counting or measuring, and having all the fear foods. Essentially, ripping off the band-aid, jumping into the deep end. You're not using any kind of slow or steady, gradually getting there, planning, structuring. You are throwing the whole planning and structure away and going for it. So in this episode, we're going to talk a bit about who this method is good for, whether or not this method is for everyone. And I also want to touch upon some of the, how do I phrase this? Some of the maybe perhaps a bit rigid mindsets I see online about all in being exclusively good or exclusively bad, or the only way to do recovery, or dangerous and irresponsible. You will get binge eating disorder. And even though I will never claim that I know everything or that I'm always right, please don't put me on that pedestal. I still thought I could maybe be a good person to talk about this because I'm someone who works with people with eating disorders and someone who works with clients both who are going all in or clients who are going a bit more planned and steady. And I also am someone who's been through recovery myself, actually not going all in, even though I would argue that later on in my recovery I kind of did in some ways, but I'll get back to that in a bit. And also, I am the person that people come to when they have challenges with all in, right? And this is important for me to get forward. When someone goes all in and it doesn't work for them, they often come to me. But also, when someone really wants to go all in and they want a practitioner that is familiar with that, what that means, familiar with things like extreme hunger, they also often come to me. So I feel like I really get it from both sides. And I feel like perhaps this makes me a little bit less biased. I don't know. You'll be the judge. So let's start talking a bit about who all in typically works well for. So all in typically works well for people who find that other approaches where there is more emphasis on planning, on doing it in step by step, is something that holds them back and feel rigid or restrictive for them. So this especially goes for people who may be having raging extreme hunger and they're like, hey, not giving into this actually feels quite restrictive and like it's holding me back. It also works well for people who are resilient and able to tolerate some degree of discomfort. Again, this is not exclusive to all in, but all in can be rough, it is a lot of changes happening very quick, and you're going to have to be someone who's prepared to handle that. And ideally, you're someone who have support around you to handle that. You have to be prepared that things may go faster weight-wise. This is not always the case with all in, but it can be the case. And another thing that you're going to have to be prepared for, especially if you're someone experiencing extreme hunger and someone who's giving into extreme hunger, is that to the outside person, it may not look like recovery. Even for some professionals, it may not look like recovery. It may look like you're going from quote-unquote one extreme to another. And as a result, there may be unhelpful comments and suggestions. Again, this is not always the case. It really depends on how much the people around you know, and also on what kind of treatment you're getting. And also it probably depends a bit on how all in looks like for you. Unfortunately, we do tend to see some degree of weight stigma here. Someone may be thrilled that their underweight client is finally eating more, but then once they reach a certain weight, it's that thing of like, are you sure you should still do this? So again, that's something to be prepared for. And in these cases, you probably would be better off focusing on what works for you rather than trying to convince everyone else or sending them a bunch of books and podcasts and resources on, you need to understand this. You need to agree with this for me to do it. I understand the need for validation, but you probably would be better off focusing on actually validating yourself and focusing on just thinking like, okay, does this work for me or not, right? Instead of thinking it should, it shouldn't. Does it work for you or not? Does it take you towards things that matter to you and away from the eating disorder? So lastly, I think doing all in, you're going to have a certain degree of mental and physical stability. So what I mean by this is mentally, if you're someone who's high risk, maybe you have certain mental health conditions that flare up during stress and can put you in acute risk of harm, or maybe you are just someone where you know that you are not going to handle the potential challenges of all in and you're going to be overwhelmed and relapse immediately, then perhaps it's not the right thing for you. That doesn't mean recovery is not for you. It doesn't even mean that all in can never be for you. It could just be that if you're in an acute vulnerable space mentally, maybe it will be a bit too much for you to handle, and that's okay. Or maybe you will handle it better than you ever thought you would. I've seen that happen as well. Just because you have an underlying mental health condition doesn't immediately make you fragile or unable to cope with certain things. But you know yourself best. You know your tolerance best. And ideally, you will work with someone who can help you identify, like, what is your window of tolerance? How can we push that a bit so that, yes, you are pushing your comfort zone, but not to a point where you crash and burn. So also physical stability. And what I mean by this is that all in probably wouldn't be great for someone who has an underlying health condition that influences, for example, how their body regulates their blood sugar. So type 1, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, or any kind of condition that may mean that there are certain limitations of what you can eat. I mean, I know this sounds like I'm being Captain Obvious here, but things like if you have celiac disease, yeah, you can still to some degree go all in, but you are still going to have to avoid gluten, right? Or if you're diabetic or pre-diabetic, I mean, yeah, of course, obviously, you're going to have to be a little bit more careful and mindful around carbohydrates and sugar than someone who has a quote-unquote normal insulin sensitivity. And I know this can be so frustrating, and as someone who works with a lot of people with chronic health conditions, I sometimes see the frustration that they feel, like, oh, I feel envious that other people, they can just go all in, eat what they want, no thoughts. But if I do that, I get extreme stomach pain, for example, in the case of things like IBS, or I get an allergic reaction if I eat anything with peanuts, and due to that, I always have to be a bit on guard. So please don't get me wrong, with these health conditions, recovery absolutely is still possible. You are just going to have to weigh up the eating disorder and the chronic health condition. You don't want to neglect either of them. You want to focus on both of them and managing both of them. And unfortunately, sometimes people think that managing a chronic health condition means that, oh, I'll just have my eating disorder then. No, but it does mean that there are certain recovery approaches that may not be as suitable to you. And you know what? That's okay. You can still recover. And lastly, in terms of physical health, of course, the obvious is you're not someone who's in acute risk of refeeding syndrome. If you are in acute risk of refeeding syndrome, then rapidly increasing your intake is something that can put you at risk, and especially doing so without medical supervision. So interestingly enough, there are some new studies around refeeding syndrome that actually shows that perhaps increasing slowly isn't as helpful as we thought in terms of decreasing the risk of it. So just because you're increasing slowly doesn't mean that you are then immediately fine. You still need medical supervision. And a lot of times there's preventative work done when someone is at risk of refeeding syndrome, certain supplements and certain medical supervision, certain blood samples, etc., etc. This is incredibly important if you are at risk of refeeding syndrome. And when people think of refeeding syndrome, a lot of people think that in order to be at risk of refeeding syndrome, you have to be severely underweight. Yes, absolutely. If someone is severely underweight, they are at an increased risk of refeeding syndrome. And this is why when I am screening clients, I unfortunately have to ask them about whether or not they are severely underweight. It is simply a risk assessment. But here's the thing. Another thing that puts people at high risk of refeeding syndrome, regardless of BMI, is recent drastic weight loss. Refeeding syndrome is actually something we see at high rates in people who have recently gone through gastric bypass surgery. And these are people who are in bigger bodies. So just because you're not underweight doesn't mean that there is no risk of refeeding syndrome. And things like alcohol abuse, for example, can also increase risk of refeeding syndrome. And also, if you're someone who is engaging in purging behaviors, this is also something that needs to be monitored by medical professionals. And I'm saying this because, and I will talk a bit more about this later in this episode, some of the people who go all in are often people who feel very disillusioned by the medical system. They feel like the medical system can't help them. Therapists don't know anything. Doctors don't know anything. And I really understand where they're coming from because yes, there is a knowledge gap, but the solution is not to completely turn away from any kind of medical care, especially not when you are in a mentally or physically vulnerable state. Your doctor don't actually even really need to understand the depths of eating disorders to monitoring you for refeeding syndrome in the recovery process, for example. So if you are in an early stage of recovery or you're someone who is in the refeeding syndrome risk group, which is being very underweight or having had a recent significant weight loss, you have to have medical supervision during refeeding. I would encourage that regardless, even if you're like, I don't think I'm high risk, still, get your bloods checked, talk with the doctor, stay on the safe side. That's so important for me to get forward because even though things like refeeding syndrome and general like refeeding complications is pretty rare, it still is something that can happen. And if it happens, it is potentially fatal. So if you are feeling unwell in recovery, you're feeling acutely unwell, talk to a doctor. And do so fast. And I'm saying this because I see some people who go all in, but they are not getting any kind of medical support. They're not getting any kind of psychological support. They don't have a therapist, they don't have a dietitian, they don't have a coach, they don't have a doctor, they have nothing. And then something doesn't work out for them. Maybe they start developing the early symptoms of refeeding syndrome. Maybe they're having a bit of a mental breakdown and feel unsupported. And instead of being like, I'm not having any support, they're instead blaming either themselves, recovery's not for me, or they start blaming the method. They start saying all in doesn't work, all in is dangerous because that was their experience, not reflecting on the fact that the way that they used that method probably wasn't safe or responsible or working for them. And yes, there are unfortunately some people in online spaces who would reinforce that belief that, oh my God, you don't need support from eating disorder. They're all just full of BS. They're all part of the outdated system, or they are just trying to make money and take advantage of you. And you know what? I'm sure there are people who were able to safely self-recover and were lucky, didn't get any mental or physical complications. They just needed to eat and get on with life. That's fine. That works for some people, I'm sure. Again, as a practitioner, I probably have bias because, again, who do people come to when they do need help? They come to me. And that's also something to always think about when engaging with any kind of information online. Always think about what could be this person's potential bias, including mine. I mean, I am always trying to be unbiased, and I would say that a lot of people aren't. But still, our decisions are always going to be shaped by our own experiences and the communities we're in. And this is also something to remember when in online recovery spaces. So I sometimes see these weird dichotomies in online recovery spaces amongst recoverers, sometimes amongst practitioners as well. And this is not just exclusive to eating disorder recovery, by the way, where it is almost like a us versus them thing. And this I see sometimes when it comes to all in recovery. And I think if I were to explain this to a layperson, they would be like, what on earth are you talking about? If I were to say, so there is this method of doing eating disorder recovery, this strategy that some people really like and have had good results with and other people don't, and as a result they're like beefing and saying that one method is dangerous or the other method is dangerous, and they're just like trying to like people be like, what? Like, can't people just do what works for them? But I think there are a few things to consider here. And that is, first of all, eating disorder recovery is something very sensitive. It also is something very important to people. And a lot of times what happens is an eating disorder takes away so much of your identity and belonging and purpose. And then you kind of then latch onto recovery for that a bit. And this is not inherently a bad thing. I think, if anything, it's a lot better to be part of a recovery community and support each other, cheer on each other. That can actually be very, very helpful, which is part why things like group therapy, group coaching in my experience, that's something I've been running in the past, can be incredibly helpful for people. And I've seen this when I run group coaching. What people will often say is that they found the group aspects to be incredibly helpful, and some even got friendships from that. I have had that experience myself. So I actually ran a support group after my recovery, and I've ended up developing friendships with people who was in that group because we were both, I was recovered at that point, but they were in recovery and then they recovered and friendships were made. Even had in-person meetups with these people. And one of these actually remained my close friend to this date, and I'm super grateful for her. So again, there's nothing bad about connecting over a shared experience. That's like the fundamental of being a human being. We do that all the time. But what is worth investigating is if this is a productive thing you're connecting over. And to what extent is the space allowing you to be you? If you're doing something that doesn't go with the group belief, are you going to be kicked out? I will say though that I have seen and heard more of this in these anti-all-in spaces more than all-in spaces. What I tend to see is that recovery spaces in general, when run by people with eating disorders, for people with eating disorders, tend to be really supportive of all-in. And because they are, the group of people that maybe have tried that method and find that for one reason or another it didn't work out for them, or maybe they entered recovery and realized that it didn't solve every problem that they had, and now they're feeling bitter and resentful because they've recovered and their life didn't turn out the way that it wanted it to be. People may feel alienated, they may feel hurt, they may feel disappointed because they've seen all of these success stories of all-in and it didn't work out that way for them. And then they may feel tricked. They may feel like, I felt influenced by you to make this decision. Why didn't it work out for me? And then they may feel tempted to again shift blame and then be like, oh yeah, but this influencer on TikTok that was talking about their all-in recovery and how it worked for them and they turn out so successful and pretty and it didn't work for me. You are promoting an unrealistic ideal. You're promoting something that is not real. And it's an understandable behavior from a psychological point of view. And if there's anything we have learned over the last few years in politics, is that when people feel alienated, they are going to be mad. They are going to often go to more extreme lengths. They are going to collect in groups and they're going to bond over that alienation. But here's the thing that I tend to see in these anti-all-in groups is that very often they inadvertently end up doing what they often criticize their opponents for, which is suggesting there is only one true way to recover and one way not to, instead of just accepting different strokes for different folks. Different things are going to work for different people. So yes, if you're someone who's tried all-in and found that it didn't work for you, your experience is valid. But please don't go and invalidate people where it did work for them. I see so much toxicity in online recovery spaces. And this is, by the way, not exclusive to the quote-unquote anti-all-in folks, but just general spaces like recovery snark. I discovered that there is an entire Reddit community dedicated to snarking on people in eating disorder recovery for their recovery mistakes or for them not quote-unquote being in real recovery. And again, I understand there is some valid criticisms here because yes, there are definitely people that are like, I'm in all-in recovery, and then they haven't restored any weight and it's been like 2 years. Fair enough. But I still don't think that going into communities where you're bonding over something negative, something that holds you back, bonding essentially over being gossipy and snarky, it's probably not good for you, right? Of course, it's not good for the people who are on the receiving end of that. That can be very devastating. And I'm saying this as someone who has a public figure in social media and someone who used to post more on social media. It is really rough mentally. It's really rough being accused of things, people talking behind your back, getting snarky comments, being expected to just tolerate it because, oh, but you're a public figure, you should tolerate this. To be completely honest and vulnerable is one of the reasons why I'm not as public on social media anymore, because I believe if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen, and that is a heat that is not good for my mental health. Social media is just not my kitchen anymore, guys. I hope to be back, but people are ruthless and I prioritize my mental health and my peace so fiercely because I know what happens if I don't do that. And I hope that you can also reflect on whether or not that's the case for you. What kind of content are you engaging with on social media? Do you feel better after you've been there? Are you doing it as a safety behavior, as a compulsion? Are you being snarky online because it makes you feel better about your recovery or yourself? Are you judging people for being currently where you used to be? A lot of times people can be very ruthless with people that are where they were. For example, you may see someone on social media that are clearly full-fledged into orthorexia, but you used to be there yourself, right? So maybe they will be where you are now at one point, but they are going through their own journey and process. And one way that this shows up specific more to All In is that I see some people who are the type of people that I spoke about early in this episode, people who actually would respond very well to All In. People who have a deep sense of understanding that this is right for them. They know this is what they need to do. Yet they are spending time online reading All In horror stories, anti-All In, because almost like they're eating disorders' way of torturing them a bit, trying to find reasons why they shouldn't do this thing that they know they need to do. They tried everything else. They know it doesn't work for them. They know that they have raging extreme hunger that they know it feels incredibly restrictive not to give into. They are ready. They may even have a practitioner willing and able to support them through it. But they are engaging in these communities and looking for the worst case scenarios instead of doing what their intuition is telling them. I kind of spoke about this in last week's episode about endlessly fantasizing about and planning your recovery but not actually doing anything. And unfortunately, I think this is something that can happen sometimes with All In. And there is this mindset that I like to call it the all in or nothing mindset. And that is someone where they are feeling very sure that All In is the right thing for them to do, but nothing is happening and they're not doing anything. I think you can probably find a lot of them in online recovery spaces, and these people would probably be the first one to offer up cheering, support, and advice when other people are going all in, but they're just not doing anything themselves. It's almost like they're gathering some kind of secondhand enjoyment, living their recovery fantasies through other people's recoveries instead of doing it themselves. And it's not because they are fake, it is because they're scared, they're conflicted. And they may really agree with the principles of All In theory, but they find it really hard to actually apply it to themselves. And they find the idea of actually being like, look, maybe I should try something else then, to be almost like betraying a group identity, betraying a core belief. And this is why I'm saying it's so important. Focus on what works for you and what doesn't, what you can do and can't, rather than what you hypothetically or theoretically think is the best way to go ahead with something. Because this can very quickly become a form of recovery perfectionism, where it's like, well, I can only do it if I do it the perfect way, if I do it the right way. If not, there's no point. And this is the core, like, underlying belief of the all in or nothing mindset. It is that all in is the only way to recover. And if you don't do it all in, it's not real recovery. So there's no point in trying. So when I have conversations with people in this point, very typically the conversation will go something like this. They will say something like, I know what I need to do. I need to go all in. And I will be like, yeah, if you feel like that's right for you, go for it. I never tell people what they can and can't do, by the way. I mean, unless someone is coming with a suggestion that I think sounds medically unsafe. But as an adult coach that works with responsible adults, if someone comes to me and they're saying, look, I have done some reflection, I've done some thinking, this is the method that I feel is right for me, then I'm saying, let's go for it. I'll support you through it. It's a deeply personal decision that I actually trust reasonable adults to make that decision themselves, right? So that's just an important side note. But yeah, this conversation with this hypothetical recoverer in the all in or nothing mindset, after I say, well, let's go for it, they typically will say, yeah, I know I should, but I just can't right now. And then here is what I will say in return. I will say, okay, fair enough. Is there anything you can do now? Can we agree on maybe setting some goals, taking some steps, maybe getting a dietitian involved to get started with some nutritional goals? And then the person will say, no, that's too rigid. I want to let it all go. I want to let go of the planning, structure, scheduling. I just want to go for it. And then I'm saying, well, okay, then do that. Right? Let's go for that then. And then like, no, I can't do it right now. And then I may try to come with some other practical suggestions and they just turn them all down because no, I want to go all in. That's the right way to do it. This is not a helpful mindset. And even though it may seem like a recovery-oriented mindset, it usually is the eating disorder underlying and latching on to the method and the whole thing of like, let's do more research, let's wait until we're ready. Again, what matters is action. What matters is you doing something that works for you with where you're at right now. All in only works if you do it. And there's not going to be a magical future moment where something just clicks and you have no fear and doubt anymore. And yes, there are some people who may spend some time contemplating all in before actually doing it. That's fine. But I see a lot of people who maybe spend years stuck in that all in or nothing mindset that I saw. And this is why it's so important for me to get forward that you don't have to go all in to recover. But what I do think is that even if you're not doing recovery with the classical all-in method, you are and can and should be implementing all-in-like actions. So often people get really hung up in either the all-in or nothing mindset that I mentioned, or they get hung up in trying to decide how to do recovery. Should I do more plan and steady? Should I go all in? And then they spend a lot of time, again, similar to all in or nothing mindset, spending time postponing and being perfectionistic around recovery. So here's the thing. Even if you are not doing all in, you're doing a bit more planned and steady and gradual, you can still implement all in actions. You should still be implementing all in actions. So, okay, what would that even mean? Typically, that may mean something like, yeah, maybe you have a meal plan, but you may have an agreement that if you're hungry for more food at dinner, have more, have a second portion, have a fourth portion. You're allowed to eat more than your meal plan. Or maybe you gradually stopped counting calories, but then it comes to a point where you're like, okay, now I'm going to go cold turkey. Maybe you didn't in the beginning. Maybe in the beginning you went from counting in great detail to just estimating and then counting only a few meals a day. But then now you come to the point where it's like, no, now I'm going to actually just rip it off. So you started a bit slow and steady, and then you came to a point where with that specific behavior, you took an all-in-like action. So don't get so hung up on the method. Get hung up on the action. And also remember, it is okay to start one method, realize that for whatever reason it's not working as well for you, and then change. It is okay to re-strategize. Sometimes people, they really want to try all in and see how it works for them, but then for one reason or another, it just didn't quite work out how they had expected. And then it is okay to be like, okay, then maybe we go back to a bit more slow, steady plan here. And then maybe at a future point, maybe feel ready to go all in again. And like I said, just because you're starting more planned and steady doesn't mean that you can't come to a point where you feel like, okay, now it's time to rip off the band-aid. I'm just going to need to do this. This is probably the more common one that I see as a coach, is I start with someone and they may start a bit more planned, steady, small steps, or steps that actually probably feel very big to them in the moment, but steps that would objectively be considered not massive steps. And then they reach a point where those steps become bigger and bigger until they are kind of taking the plunge, right? That is okay. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And you don't owe any recovery method or person your loyalty and your full compliance. I think any practitioner that emphasizes to you that this is the only way to do something are a bit red flags, really, because there is no one way to do something. I think that when it comes to recovery, there are a few key things that you need to cover that are, in my opinion, non-negotiable, and those things are the 4 R's. If you haven't checked it out already, I've done a podcast episode on that titled The 4 R's. So for example, I don't think you can fully recover if you're not challenging your sneaky eating disorder behaviors, challenging your fear foods. But that doesn't mean that the only way to do that is by going all in. You can also gradually implement more challenges, gradually do more tasks and set more goals towards that. And then you may find that at a certain point, you know that you're just going to have to take the plunge with those last little behaviors that are left. There are plenty of ways to get to a destination. There are some unavoidable things that needs to be done. Yes, absolutely. But there is no one way. And be very careful with anyone trying to tell you that there's only one way. Especially if you find that this one way, for one reason or another, doesn't work for you. So what are some common fears or pitfalls with all in? What are some of the common criticisms? So I think a potential pitfall and also a common criticism is something that what I have mentioned already, which is doing all in without having much support, without having medical supervision. I wouldn't recommend it, but yes, I have also heard people who have found that doing recovery in that DIY way have worked for them. I just think that it increases the risk of something going wrong or there being some undetected physical or mental issue that doesn't get properly identified until a little bit later than perhaps it should. And unfortunately, that is also the case with recovery in general. Sometimes people may have had something underlying and they didn't realize until recovery. They may have assumed that something was due to the eating disorder when it wasn't, or may have been something that the eating disorder had in some way suppressed. A good example is polycystic ovarian syndrome. Very random example, but this is just some classical thing of what I'm speaking about, where someone may have developed hypothalamic amenorrhea as a result of an eating disorder, and then they start recovering, and then they're like, hey, I have some funny period stuff going on, and it turns out they actually had polycystic ovarian syndrome. And then they're like, well, did my recovery cause this? No, it didn't cause it. PCOS is not something that you just get like that. That is not how it works. It is a genetic condition, something that you're born with. Interestingly enough, people with PCOS are actually born with more eggs than people without PCOS. So essentially that is what drives a lot of the symptoms. And I mean, I probably should and probably will do an episode on PCOS in the future, because if there's one health condition that is just so misunderstood and there's so much BS around, it's PCOS. And it causes so much fear-mongering and so much mistreatment and misdiagnosis. And it's something around is like, stop it. But yeah, and same thing can go with mental health, right? So I don't love the idea that an eating disorder is always the result of some like deep underlying trauma, and then you have to fix that deep underlying trauma dynamic before you can start recovery. I actually think that's not true. Yes, for some people, an eating disorder starts in response to a traumatic event or response to something else underlying. But for a lot of people, it doesn't. For a lot of people, their life is actually pretty okay, but they just happen to have a bit of an abnormal response to being in an energetic deficit. Then again, some people may find that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Some people may also find that recovery brings things to surface. Even if they didn't have any underlying mental health condition, they may find that, recovery is scary. Going back and re-engaging with life after an eating disorder and after recovery is scary, and it could be very reasonable to have support with that. And I say this because I see a lot of people who have that very independent mindset. They often feel so embarrassed and ashamed to admit that, oh yeah, I do have things that I struggle with. They feel like that may mean that they did recovery wrong or they were wrong about something. And it's like, no, again, like, you are a person. You're allowed to have a nuanced, wide range of experiences. It's okay to need support. Just because you're feeling fed up with traditional narratives about eating disorders doesn't mean that if you are someone where that traditional narrative actually fits your situation, should just ignore that. Yes, I agree. I hate when people talk about how parents, quote unquote, cause eating disorders, and I think that's incredibly harmful and not true. But if you are someone where you are in a family dynamic that has influenced your relationship with food and body, it's okay to be open about that. It's okay to talk about that without feeling like you're betraying some kind of cause. And I think that would probably be more my criticism, is that I feel that some potential individuals in all-in spaces, not talking about anyone specific because I'm terminally offline, so I know very little about other recovery influencers, but again, something more like what I hear from clients. There are some things I hear where it feels a bit bombastic and doesn't allow for nuance and doesn't allow for different experiences. But the criticism that I sometimes hear around all-in is a bad method because it doesn't address underlying issues is not actually one I agree with. And the reason for this is that even if you are doing recovery in a more planned and steady way, still typically you won't start really addressing many like underlying issues or traumas until you are in a better place in terms of weight restoration and refeeding. And I'm saying this as someone who didn't go all in and someone who did a very traditional way of doing treatment in some ways. I mean, I think modern in terms of what I hear from a lot of other people's experiences with eating disorder treatment. But at least one of the things that I was told very early on was that, look, like right now you are undernourished, you are underweight, your brain is just not operating clearly, and it would be kind of pointless for us to sit here and talk about feelings and family dynamics or traumas or anything like that until you are more nourished and refed. And in my impression is that that is a relatively common approach in eating disorder treatment. It also is a criticism some people have, but I actually think this is fair. I think you're going to have to work on the refeeding and weight restoration first. And I think this is what All In does. All In allows you, in my opinion, to get to a point where you can be better equipped to, if there are underlying traumas or issues or family dynamic or whatever it is, you can work on that from a better, more nourished state. And actually for me, my most common criticism when it comes to eating disorder treatment is that I think there is a lot of focus on solving the underlying issues before you start with refeeding and weight restoration. And I don't really think that is productive. I think it holds people back. And also think that the group of people who actually don't really have much underlying issues, their life is quite fine and their mental health is quite fine, but they just happen to have an eating disorder, they may end up spending a lot of time stuck in that, like endlessly searching and endlessly looking for answers, maybe where there are none. For some people, an eating disorder is their problem. For other people, they have a lot of other problems that make it hard for them to let go of their eating disorder. Let's leave space for both. Another criticism with All In is, or specifically about more giving into extreme hunger, is that it encourages binge eating and that it risks you developing binge eating disorder. So here's the thing. The most common predictor of future weight gain, future binge eating, of developing binge eating disorder is restriction. Essentially, the more you're working on restricting your intake, suppressing your weight, the more those urges to binge is going to go up. Feeling very hungry after you have gone through a prolonged period of starvation is completely normal. It's literally been part of human history since us human beings ended up on this earth. We have gone through periods of famine, and then once food is available, we feast. If we didn't, we would all be extinct by now. So I think attempts to pathologize the literal most common thing experienced by humans and animals, it just doesn't make any sense. So my experience when working with All In clients is that it is more common for them to start really losing their appetite and losing their interest in food rather than the opposite. So typically they start All In and they have extreme hunger and food is so fun and exciting and woohoo, it's a big dopamine kick. And then as recovery goes on, it's like, and there's a lot of mechanical eating. They kind of have to force themselves a little bit to eat. It just doesn't feel as good anymore. And they have to be a bit mindful so that they don't fall into restriction rather than, oh, I need to be careful so I don't eat too much. Again, this is just what I see as someone who works with people who go all in. Unfortunately, and this is where I will agree with the criticism, some people who go all in, or people who experience reactive hunger, even without any intention of going all in, will often panic and then fall into restrictive and compensatory behaviors. And if you look at the diagnostic criteria of binge eating disorder, I mean, essentially binge eating disorder, there shouldn't be any restrictive compensatory behaviors, but a lot of times there are. I've made an episode about this in the past called binge eating disorder and fat phobia, so do check that out. And what I tend to see with people who do end up with binge eating disorder is that yes, it actually very often is because they're experiencing a reactive hunger situation in response to past restriction, but instead of just letting it happen, just being like, well, crap, this sucks, but it's part of the process and I'm just gonna have to go through it, they panic, they try to solve it, they try to compensate, they try all sorts of hacks to get rid of it, and then it just becomes a cycle. So yes, I do agree that going through reactive hunger can lead to binge eating disorder and bulimia, and very often we do see that most people, for example, with anorexia, not most people, but a lot of people with anorexia actually end up developing bulimia, and that is because, in my opinion, they are experiencing reactive hunger, they panic, they don't know what to do, and they start compensating and restricting and purging. But I just don't really see that when people do go through it, I don't tend to see that it becomes a habit. They just become addicted to food. I tend to see a bit the opposite, that it's not as exciting anymore. They're not as hungry anymore. Because the whole point of recovery, the whole point of going through extreme hunger, yes, in the moment, it may seem extreme. It may not be healthy. It may not appear like a healthy way of eating and living, but you're doing this for a short period of time so that you can get out on the other side and then create your life. You're not meant to spend 2 years just laying on the sofa eating Ben and Jerry's every single meal. It's a temporary thing so that you can get out there and live your life and get back into the things that you love. And that is often also a motivation for people who do all in. They're like, I want my life back. I'm fed up by this. I just need to do it. I want to get through this so I can move on with my life. Well, what if I just get so used to eating Ben and Jerry's every meal and laying on my sofa all day? Well, I don't necessarily think that's recovery's fault. That probably sounds more like if you have no interest or passions, you don't want to go to work, you don't want to study, you don't want to see friends, you don't want to do anything. That to me sounds a bit more like depression rather than being to do with recovery and an eating disorder. Temporarily, yes, it is very much common when you're going through recovery to be like, I don't want to do anything, I just want to eat and chill. That's completely fine in recovery. But again, remember what I said, recovery is a temporary time period that you're going to have to go through to get out on the other side. It is not necessarily a way of living. And I think this is definitely to do with definitions, because some people would say, no, I disagree with that. I think recovery is what you do for the rest of your life after an eating disorder. And recovery is about learning to, quote unquote, be normal again. And yeah, fair enough, but I do think we're going to have to accept that you're not in a normal situation and you may have some humps and ups and downs before you get to the point of normalcy. Before you can eat completely normally again, you probably will have to spend some time correcting that underlying deficit, correcting the mental and physical restrictions that's been going on until things starts to become more normal. And if you never do that, if you just say, well, I'm just going to eat like a normal person, but you are actually someone who's been starved, then chances are you're not going to be able to just eat like a normal person. So again, think of all in as a temporary extreme to correct a past extreme, aka the eating disorder, to get to a point of future normalcy. So again, with this whole thing of, but it's not healthy, well, I mean, it's a temporary situation you're going through. Yeah, it wouldn't be healthy if you did like this for the rest of your life. If you never left the sofa and you never had a vegetable for the rest of your life, of course that wouldn't be physically healthy, but it is not for the rest of your life. And if anything, going through recovery means that you start enjoying a variety of foods again instead of putting cake on the highest pedestal there is. It means that you can start actually enjoying movement again and doing so safely in a way that is mentally and physically healthy for you. So the whole health argument or the whole like making it a habit or developing binge eating disorder, it's just not something I can agree with. And I'm saying that as someone who people will tend to go to when reactive hunger, they have issues with reactive hunger, or they have issues with all in not working, they tend to go to me for troubleshooting. So of course I see people experiencing challenges, but someone just, I was just kind of bored, so I just made it like a habit to just eat 10,000 calories every single day. That's just not what I see. It just feels a bit like a bad faith hypothetical, something people are like, oh yeah, but this could happen, but then you actually look at, okay, but what is happening? What are the very real challenges that people may experience in all in? And that is just not really one that I see. I'm sure it could happen. I'm sure there may exist some hypothetical people that experience that, but it's just not what I see. I see patterns in my work. I see patterns of challenges, but that's just not one of them. What I tend to see is people freaking out, panicking about how much food they've eaten, panicking about their weight gain, going into some kind of restrictive behavior as a result. And some of these people move on to be diagnosed with something like bulimia or binge eating disorder. And also I have seen cases of people having an underlying physical condition that may have been the root of some of the weight gain that they're experiencing, or an underlying condition that has influenced their appetite. So for example, in the cases of reactive hunger, hyperphagia, which is the clinical name for excessive hunger, is a common, well-known side effect of starvation, but it is also a common and well-known side effect of certain other medical conditions. And another thing that I sometimes see is people putting everything on recovery blaming everything on recovery or having very unrealistic expectations of what recovery is actually going to bring them. For example, they may be thinking that if they recover, they are just going to wake up and have everything they wanted in life. Or they may be in their recovery comfort zone and have a hard time with re-engaging with the world. And then another thing that I also see is people blaming every ill, whether mental or physical, that happens during or after recovery on recovery. Maybe someone's depression flared up and they're like, oh yeah, it's because recovery. It's because of my weight gain. It's because of the food. Or maybe they have a physical health condition that didn't become apparent until they recovered. And then they're like, well, recovery caused this, when that's not necessarily the case. Or they may feel like because they recovered into a bigger body, they did something wrong. And they look at other people who recovered into smaller bodies. They're like, well, they must have done something right. If I hadn't gone all in, I would have been in a smaller body. When that is not necessarily the case at all. And it's interesting because I see this in people regardless of their method. I also have people who come to me, they're like, look, I restricted my way through recovery and now I'm in a bigger body. Could it have been different if I had just gone all in? I always say that recovery, it doesn't immediately make your life perfect. It just gives you foundation to build on. It gives you a chance to build a life that is good and meaningful for you. And be careful with blaming what's caused by the eating disorder on recovery. People may be blaming their recovery for their extreme hunger, when actually, why do you have extreme hunger to begin with? Well, you was restricting. Or they may be blaming recovery on their digestive issues. Well, where did those digestive issues start to begin with? What is it that is known notoriously to cause digestive issues? It's an eating disorder. Even if recovery may have hypothetically worsened something, why did you have that issue to begin with? And also, an eating disorder is also an issue. So notice how there is a lot of anger towards yourself, but not so much anger against the eating disorder. So yeah, I think those would be most of the criticisms I see against All In, and also just some of my thoughts around that. I absolutely think there are valid criticisms, but I think that's what those criticisms sometimes fail to acknowledge, is that everyone is different and different things work for different people, and that a lot of times what may seem like it could be a good criticism on the surface, for example, oh, but you'll just get used to eating this way forever, is not necessarily something that actually happens in reality when you actually ask people who work with eating disorders, or when you ask people who've gone through recovery themselves. Do people sometimes get a bit stuck in their comfort zone with recovery and find it scary to let go of recovery and start re-engaging with the world? Yes, absolutely. This is something I've done a lot on in the past. I've done an episode, for example, called Recovery to Recovered, Re-engaging with the World. So that's a thing, but that's something very different in my opinion. I think that the criticisms towards All In has been reinforced or strengthened by the fact that some people who promote All In are quite rigid about it. So it becomes almost like both sides becoming very rigid. But again, this is not the case for most people. So I think that when I talk about these like anti-All In or pro-All In, I'm talking about a small minority of people. The vast majority of people are regulated and reasonable enough to know that different things work for different people, and they may try something, and if it doesn't work for them, they're going to be like, well, fair enough, didn't work for me, doesn't mean it won't work for anyone else, I'm just going to try something different. That is what I would say normal, healthy, sane, responsible adults would do. But we're talking about a mental health condition, and we're talking about people who are vulnerable. And we're also talking about a group of people that have higher rates of things like neurodivergence, which is an interesting thing with neurodivergence, especially autism. People with autism may have a tendency towards literal thinking, black and white thinking. But also what I tend to see in autistic people is that they're often very good analytical thinkers who spot patterns very well. They're often the ones to see through it. So I think that it's interesting. Autistic people are probably the ones that are really easy to get to join a cult, but also really hard to get to join a cult, depending on what autistic person you're talking with. It's like they can be the most vulnerable people to propaganda, but also the most resilient towards it, where they don't even bite when it comes to basic marketing. It's fascinating. But still, there also are things like certain personality disorders, like BPD, which is a hugely stigmatized condition, unfortunately. Often a lack of empathy, even amongst treatment professionals for this condition. I remember that myself when I did my psychology degree. I very quickly found that, okay, there's a little bit of a different mindset towards cluster B personality disorders, which I mean, again, this could be for a future episode, but I have so much compassion for people with BPD. And I find it weird that there is not the same compassion for people with personality disorders than other mental health conditions. But anyways, some people, for whatever reason, whether it's just their personality or neurodivergence or an underlying personality disorder or mental health condition, can be a bit more vulnerable to fall into extremes or to fall into certain subgroups that aren't good for them and to just stay quite stuck, essentially. So it's not that people are bad or that people are stupid or that people have evil intentions, right? It is just often that people are vulnerable. People are fragile. People are desperate, right? Recovery is typically something, it's like your biggest wish, but your biggest fear. So we're dealing with a very sensitive topic, which is why I think there can be so strong reactions against it. And why someone, for example, who are doing all in feel extremely triggered if anyone has a bad experience that they're reporting or they are quote unquote against it. And this can probably also explain why people who have tried all in and it hasn't worked for them can become quite resentful and spend a lot of time, talking up against all in because they feel like, well, this let me down. Why are you guys not talking about this? Why is this working for you guys and not for me? I can understand and have compassion for both of those experiences, and I welcome every perspective really in this podcast and in my coaching practice. I'm saying this because sometimes people think that I'm aligned with certain beliefs that they almost apologize, for example, for, oh, I have poor body image, I quote unquote feel fat, I'm sorry for saying that, I know it's a bad thing, please don't judge me. And I'm like, dude, I'm working in this field. You have an eating disorder. You are allowed to have politically incorrect thoughts and feelings. You are allowed to have doubts. You are allowed to have questions. You are allowed to have disagreements. Anyone who make you feel like you can't, recovery or not, right? That to me sounds a bit like a red flag. So just to recap, because I know this has been a long episode, but it's one that has been requested and one that I've been wanting to do for some time, but I really wanted to take my time, sit down, think about what to say, even though I've gone waffling about a lot in this episode. But to conclude, I think all in can be an amazing method for some people. And for other people, it is a method that just isn't for them, whether it is to do with their mental or physical health, where they're at, or they just don't want to do it. They just don't feel ready. Or they may be someone who is in that mindset I told you of, that all in or nothing mindset, where it actually becomes a way of postponing recovery to endlessly focusing on the hypothetical future moment when you're going to go all in, but it's not going to be now. So to recap, who do I think all in can be good for? Well, I think it could be good for people who experience a certain level of reactive hunger, where it may feel quite restrictive or uncomfortable mentally or physically to not give into it. Again, you don't necessarily have to go all in to lean into extreme hunger or reactive hunger. It can be done in different ways, but this is just an example here. I also think it can be good for people who are prepared for bodily changes and prepared that these may happen faster or differently than what they had expected. Also, for people who can actually restrain themselves to avoid any kind of restrictive or compensatory behaviors. If you know that you are just going to go straight into purging, straight into self-harm or any kind of dangerous behavior, then it may not be safe for you, and that's okay. It also would be for someone who does not have any underlying condition. That means that it may not be the best decision for their health, mentally or physically. And of course, things like refeeding syndrome has to be considered here. And also, you're going to have a sense of having a healthy mindset around it. You're going to have to be realistic about what it is. You're going to have to be committed, and you're going to have to be willing to take a leap of faith and explore the unknown. And also, ideally, you would have good support. You will have a treatment team, or at least someone who can support you professionally through this, to understand what things like extreme hunger is and can help guide you through it. And also some kind of professional that can keep an eye on your general mental or physical health. So who is it not for? Well, I don't think it is for people who find that their hunger and appetite just doesn't take them anywhere near where they need to be. If you're going all in, but you have no appetite, and all in for you mean eating very little, then probably is not the best method. Or if you find that you are hungry, but you just have it's just not happening, you're just not giving in, then it is okay to maybe need a bit more structure and guidance in terms of your intake. Like, for example, a meal plan or a meal structure. Please don't listen when people say it is inherently and always bad to use a meal plan or a meal structure in recovery. If it is what you need, that's okay. It helped me a lot in my own recovery, but also there are people who just doesn't work well with it. They may have had it in the past, they may have found it restrictive. That's okay as well. Different strokes for different folks. It also probably isn't for, like I mentioned, people who struggle with certain high-risk behaviors, can't hold themselves back from engaging in things like purging or laxative abuse, fall right into restriction. Also people who may have underlying mental or physical health conditions that I mentioned as well, refeeding syndrome risk, poor distress tolerance, low commitment to recovery, etc., etc. These are just things to consider. You may listen to this and be like, wow, I'm actually kind of in between here. That's okay as well. Maybe you find that doing an in-between approach can work for you as well. Maybe you are doing a little bit of all-in behaviors in some areas, but in other areas you aren't. And maybe you can then gradually at a future point, maybe go all in. So maybe you're going cold turkey with movement and you're going cold turkey with weighing your food and tracking calories, but you are still eating after a meal plan that a dietitian gave you. And maybe at a future point, it's time to let that meal plan go. Maybe you decide that, you know what, I'm just going to chuck it out and see what happens. Or maybe you decide, well, I'm going to do one meal a day where I just go completely all in. I just do whatever I want and see what happens, right? Do it in a collaborative way that is safe and actually works for you. Again, key takeaway for this episode, different things work for different people. The most important part is that you do something. Don't spend time endlessly stuck debating, should I not, should I do this way, should I do that way? You're going to have to do something. And be a bit mindful of online recovery spaces. And remember, in online recovery spaces, the people who typically hang out there are not recovered people. It typically, when it comes to things like all in, a lot of times you will hear about the horror stories, but you won't hear as much about the success stories, because the people who recover all in, I'm saying this especially because I work with these people who recover, do all in, move on with their lives. Like, that's what happened. They don't come to me and say, oh, I spent a bunch of time on recovery Reddit, right? They're like out living their lives, which is really good for them, but it also means that it's going to be a bit of a situation of you're going to hear more about when it doesn't work out. This goes with a lot of things, by the way. In general, when people have an easy, smooth experience with something, they just move on and they don't talk about it that much. If people have a difficult, rough experiences with something and they haven't resolved the issue that they were trying to resolve, then it's going to be a different situation. So do keep that in mind as well. At the end of the day, you are going to have to really have a conversation with yourself in some ways, or maybe with the professional as well, about what is the right thing for you. I often tend to find that it is a very deeply personal decision for people. And when someone comes to me and they're saying, this is what I want to do, unless there is a strong reason why not to, I tend to say, you know what, I'll support you through it. I trust that if you have decided this is something you want to try, all in, then I'm here to support you through it. And that is the approach that me and my other coaches take. And then some people try it and realize maybe it wasn't for them. That's okay as well. We're not kicking you out of coaching, and you're not a failure, and recovery is still for you. And even if it doesn't work out, you are extremely brave for trying something. That is the first step. So it's kind of a win anyways. Alright guys, this was a very long episode, but there was a lot to talk about and a lot that I wanted to talk about for a while. I do understand this is a sensitive topic, it's a controversial topic. It shouldn't really be, but it kind of is. And you're allowed to disagree with me, that's completely fine. My experience is just based on someone who really have seen different sides of it, and my opinion remains that I think it is an excellent method for a lot of people, but also for some people it doesn't work, and that's fine. Have an amazing day and week ahead, guys, and I will see you in the next episode.